The CSS animations feature lets us create smooth, multi-step animations using a keyframe-based syntax. They're very similar to CSS transitions in that they let us change the values of properties over a given duration. But the main difference between CSS transitions and animations is that transitions are immediately applied when property values change, while animations only execute when we bind them to a selector, and the changes in CSS values are defined separately in a set of keyframes. We can then control their direction, play state, how they iterate, and what happens before and after they execute with a few simple CSS declarations. No JavaScript necessary. Browser support is also looking good, as animations are currently supported in all modern browsers. IE9 and below, however, do not support animations, and WebKit-based browsers still need the vendor prefix. So first, let's take a look at some of the components that make up a keyframe rule. Before we begin, I suggest you watch the previous deep dive on CSS transitions and transforms for a better understanding of some of the animation properties we'll be covering in this video, because they go hand in hand. Animations work basically on the same values as CSS transitions. CSS animations consist of two components, a set of keyframes that indicate the start and end states, as well as possible intermediate waypoints, and a set of properties that reference those keyframes to execute the animation sequence. With these properties, we can, for example, control how many times the animation iterates, whether or not it alternates between the start and end values, and if it should be running or in a paused state. We can also delay its start time. In our HTML file, we have a div element with the class wrap, and nested inside is a div with the class progbar, short for progress bar. So I've dressed this up with a few simple CSS styles to make our div look like a progress bar or status indicator of some sort. We'll be creating a basic animation that will expand the width of the progress bar from 0 to 100%. To create this animation, we'll first need to define the different animation states in a set of keyframes. So we'll need to create a keyframe rule which will contain the keyframes that indicate the start and end states of the animation. To create a keyframe rule, we'll need to use the keyword @ followed by WebKit, since I'm on Chrome, and keyframes, followed by the name we want to give our animation. Now the name is up to us, so let's give it the name slide. And we'll be referencing this name later when we call our animation sequence using animation properties. So inside the curly braces is where we define our keyframe selectors and set the property values we want to animate. We can specify keyframes in percentages or with the keywords from and to. So let's create our first animation sequence with the keywords from and to. So for our first keyframe declaration, we'll type from and a set of curly braces. Then below that, to, and another set of curly braces. We'll need to animate the width property of our progbar. So let's first start with a width of 0% in our from declaration. And in our to declaration, we will give it a width of 100%. So the from and to keyframes will animate the width from 0% to 100%. And we don't necessarily need to define keyframe blocks in between because the browser sort of fills in those intermediate points for us. So this is a very basic keyframe rule that we've just created. In order to see this animation sequence, we'll need to bind it to a selector by referencing the slide animation name in a CSS rule. Otherwise, the animation will have no effect. We want our animation applied to our progbar element, so we'll need to reference the slide keyframe sequence we just created inside of the progbar rule. At the very least, we need to define two animation values to execute our animation: the animation name and the animation duration. Now, there's a shorthand property for this, but we'll first define each value individually. So first, in the animation name property is where we reference the animation sequence we want applied. So we'll type WebKit animation name. And we'll want to call the slide sequence we created earlier. Next, we need to define how long the animation should take to complete one cycle. So we'll do this with the animation duration property. Now, this is very similar to the transition duration property we covered in the previous deep dive on CSS transitions. It accepts a time value in seconds or milliseconds. So here, we'll set the animation duration to 2 seconds. So we'll go ahead and save this and view it in the browser. And when we refresh, there we see our first CSS animation. So I'll refresh this again, and we can see how the progress bar goes from 0 to 100% width in 2 seconds. We'll go over the rest of the animation properties in the next video, but first, let's take a look at percentage values in keyframe declarations. So using percentages to create keyframes allows us more control over how the animation progresses, because we can control the intermediate steps of the animation sequence, not just the start and end states. So let's go back to our slide keyframe rule and change the from and to values to percentages. So we'll make from 0% and to 100%. So 0% is the beginning of the animation, and 100% is where the animation is complete. 0, like we just saw, is equivalent to the value from, and 100% is equivalent to the value to. So from and to is exactly the same as using 0% and 100%. And as we can see, it works exactly the same way. But like I said, we have more control now because we can add other percentage values in between 0 and 100% to specify more waypoints along the animation sequence. So for example, we'll go ahead and add another keyframe declaration at 30%, where we will make the width 50%. So at the 30% point, the progress bar will be 50% wide, then it will continue to the end state. So let's save this and run it in the browser. And there you go. And we'll go ahead and add one more keyframe declaration at 70%, where we will make the width 80%. So we'll save this. So now at 30% and 70% in, we can see those shifts in animation. I'll go ahead and refresh it again. If we want more than one keyframe to share the same properties, we can simply combine them as a comma-separated list of percentage values. So for example, let's have the 30% value share the same property as 60%. So we'll simply add a comma followed by 60%. So now at 30 and 60%, the width at the progress bar will be 50%. So let's take a look at this in the browser. When we refresh, we'll see how it holds at 50%, then proceeds to 70%, and finally its end state. Let's take a look at it again. These keyframes we created determine the behavior of one cycle of the animation. But later, we'll see how the animation sequence can iterate more than once or infinitely. If we take a look at our animation again, notice the easing function happening between each keyframe. So it eases from 0 to 50%, then 80%, and finally eases to its end state. Well, just like with CSS transitions, animations have a timing function and by default, its value is also ease. The animation timing function property describes how the animation will progress over one iteration. The timing function we set gets applied between each keyframe, not over the entire animation. So that's why we're seeing each keyframe easing to the next value. So let's go ahead and change the timing function to one of the other values. So back in our CSS, up here in our progbar rule, we'll type WebKit animation timing function. Like I said, an animation timing function works just like the transition timing function and accepts the same values. So let's go ahead and try the value ease out. When we refresh it in the browser, now the animation starts at a constant speed, then slows down towards the end of each keyframe. Let's look at it again. But let's instead make it linear so that it maintains a linear motion at a constant speed with no easing. So we'll change ease out to the value linear, and we'll refresh. And now we can see the linear motion in our animation. Like transition timing functions, we can also use the values ease in out, and the cubic Bezier function. Again, check out the deep dive on transitions to learn all about timing functions and cubic Bezier curves. Finally, we'll need to go back and add the vendor prefixed keyframe rules for older versions of Firefox and Opera, and the unprefixed rule for the latest versions of Firefox. So we will go ahead and make this Moz O, and this will be unprefixed. We do have to define them individually. Unfortunately, we cannot simply comma separate the different selectors. If we do that, the entire rule will be ignored by the browser. We'll go ahead and do the same with the animation name property and the animation duration property, and finally, the animation timing function. Like with CSS transitions, we can apply animations only to certain animatable properties. The W3C does have a list of all the animatable properties we can use in keyframe rules. You can view the full property table at w3.org or check out the link in the video notes.